So it is with great pleasure that we open this second session, and I'm very happy to welcome Professor Alparslan Açıkgenç. Professor Açıkgenç is very famous in Turkey. I know that he is the professor of some of my colleagues, and in a broader sense, he is the teacher of all of us. And so I think he's also well known for his publications abroad. He has worked in various fields of philosophy like epistemology, philosophy of science, of course Islamic philosophy, tasawwuf. So I think that reflects in the paper that he's presenting today, again having to do with the causal theory, as it is put forward by an Islamic thinker from the Iranian tradition, Mullah Sadra, but also very closely intertwined with contemporary developments in sciences, and especially the evolutionary theory. So we are looking forward to this.
Thank you very much. I will try to outline Sadra's theory of causation, which is original in a way, but it's also very difficult, very complicated. If you pay attention on certain parts of his works, it might be misleading. So you have to really carefully examine all of his works, because at one point, as I shall talk just now about it, he appears to be defending the necessary connection between the cause and effect, but at some other points he seems to defend a theory of causation which can be called occasionalism. As my colleague pointed out, Sadra is a very well-known late period Muslim philosopher, coming from the Iranian tradition, according to Nasser, theosophic tradition, as he terms it. He is a contemporary of Descartes. One of my colleagues, Ernest Occasionalism, he always used to point this out, because it is very interesting to bring these two traditions together, and you see at one side in the West there is a different development taking place, and in the Muslim world there is a different development taking place in the philosophical arena. So Mullah Sadra's understanding of causation can be perhaps described as the improved version of the Aristotelian theory of causality, improved version of it, as it is applied in this system, is valid in a case, but if we describe it in this way, this would be valid in case of individual events. Or more properly, in the Sadrian sense, if we use his own terminology, we should say individual processes, existential processes, rather than the evolutionary existential process as a whole. How can we combine these two things? I will try to expose that a little bit. Now, prior to Mullah Sadra, there are two major theories of causality. One is the very well-known theory developed by Aristotle and applied in the Muslim world by his followers, such as Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, and later on Ibn Rushd, and all of these, as you know, are called Mashari philosophers, peripatetic, in other words, Muslim peripatetics. And I give a name to this theory. I call it the necessitarian theory of causation, because it depends primarily the necessary connection between cause and effect, without any interpretation. I mean, in every case, this is true. It is applied in nature, in physical explanations, almost in all philosophical theories. So it is very rigid. The second one is developed primarily, it's actually started unfolding itself from the early Mu'tazilates, as our Professor Tariq this morning, he talked about it. In a way, a little bit formulated by Al-Ash'ari, but actually put into a philosophical, full-fledged philosophical theory by Al-Ghazali. And that is almost in the 12th century. And it is this theory, perhaps, described also as occasionalism. And again, our professor will talk about this theory. The problem is, of course, we have to give a criterion for occasionalism. Nazif this morning he made some comments on that. But perhaps if we want to express this in a single statement, maybe we would say God's will is the occasion for the connection between cause and effect. Maybe, I don't know if that is satisfactory to everyone or not. Anybody defending this would be an occasionalist. And therefore, the necessary connection is denied. But at the same time, I would like to point out that there is a critique leveled against these philosophers that they deny causality. The professor this morning very well explained again that this is not correct. And that is why we prefer to call it causal indeterminism, which is very good actually. So they don't deny causation, but they bring a different explanation for it, including Mullah Sadra, as we shall see now. Now, so where can we see Mullah Sadra in between these two theories? I would like to start from mainly I utilize this magnum opus Al-Asfar, which is 9 volumes. In the earlier, the first volume, there is a chapter in which he tries to prove that the connection is necessary. And let me just read you the title of this chapter, which makes it very clear. Concerning the necessity of a cause upon the existence of its effect, and the necessity of an effect upon the existence of its cause. So this is very clear, right? Defending the necessitarian theory. And on the basis of this, in some parts of his physics, he gives a definition of cause and effect, again with the Ibn-Sinian way, following the Aristotelian tradition. And these two definitions are very much common, as you can see. Number one, a cause is that whose existence leads to the existence of something else, and whose non-existence also leads to the non-existence of something else. In other words, if the cause is non-existent, the effect will not follow. The second, a cause is that upon which the existence of something depends, and it becomes impossible through its non-existence. The effect, in other words, again, becomes impossible through its non-existence, but it does not become necessary by its existence. Here, a little bit, a door is opened, right, for the occasions. Now, he gives a few explanations, again, following the Aristotelian tradition. He says that there could be two kinds of causes, incomplete and complete causes. If the cause of a caused event is complete cause, then on the basis of the first definition, there cannot be any other cause of the effect. Hence, there can be but only one complete cause. Incomplete causes are, on the other hand, those factors which cannot produce an effect by themselves. Namely, if a cause by itself cannot produce an effect without coming together with at least one more cause, then it is incomplete. And there are primarily 4 incomplete causes that we all know, the famous Aristotelian causes: formal, material, efficient, and final causes. So far, Sadrian causal theory is clear. He is following the Muslim peripatetics, and in this sense he is Aristotelian. But there are two chapters that are included in his discussion of what I translate as ontological becoming, Jal in Arabic, which parts him from the peripatetic path. The departure starts actually very clearly in these two chapters. The first chapter tries to refute the arguments of those who claim that existence is not liable to being and effect. Actually, he defends the theory that in the true sense only existence. But here, existence is effect. I must admit that in my translation of wujud, sometimes I use the word existence, sometimes being. This I have to mention. It might confuse because in the Western tradition, as you know, there is a distinction between the two. Sometimes I pay attention to that distinction when I use, and that is why I am translating here as existence. In the actual becoming, in other words. When it becomes, then he's using. In Arabic, of course, wujida is used, or sometimes mawjud. The word mawjud also refers to being, but individual beings in that sense. In other words, existence. So the second chapter is also devoted to the refutation of the claim that the actual effect of a cause is essences becoming existent. Because both the true cause and the true effect are being, according to Mughal. They both are being. Now, essences never become in the true sense. They are not real. They do not exist. They don't have any external existence, in other words. And therefore, we cannot talk about them. They simply arise in the existential movement in our mind. So we have to, from time to time, refer to Mullah Sadr's ontology in order to follow what he is trying to say here. In his ontology, he takes only being as real. There is only one being, and there are no essences. Essences exist only in our mind. When being moves from one level to another level, at each level, our mind is able to capture the difference, and out of that difference, the essence arises in the mind, according to this explanation. This long discussion is not included under his discussion of causality, and in fact, in some other cases where there is no mention of the subject, might be, for example, wujud, tahqiq al-wujud, the explanation of being, then you might see some sentences making reference to causality. So you have to gather all those things. So therefore, it is easy to see some of his explanations concerning causation. Fazl Rahman clearly made a reference to Sadra's conclusion. The cause alters only existence, not an essence. But he did not discuss the overall impact of this on his general theory of causality. So therefore, what I am trying to say is that Mullah Sadr is actually defending both theories at the same time. But how can you defend it? I mean, the necessitarian and the occasionalist theory, they both. And this you can see in Fazl Rahman's book, The Philosophy of Mullah Sadr. But Fazl Rahman does not, although in the final chapter of his book, he talks about the existential movement under the Arabic version, Tashkik al-Wujud, which he translates as systematic ambiguity of being into English. But I prefer to translate it as existential evolutionary movement, because Fazl Rahman pays attention to the logical impact of the theory, and he pays more attention to that aspect, and it is why he translates like that. In the first chapter of his book, you can see the reason for this. But then, if you translate like that, the existential movement is totally lost, the process is lost. He discusses the process, I'm not saying that he's not discussing, he discusses this, but then it's difficult to bring its relevance to his causal theory. And that's what I try to do here. So Sadra declares in his ontology the cause of an effect, and the effect of a cause is nothing but real existence. Therefore, essences can neither be causes nor effects in the real sense. They are produced in the mind only after individuals come into existence. This is what Sadra is saying. Now, if we hold this view of causality on the one hand, and consider this doctrine of the evolutionary existential world process, or simply the Sadrian cosmological process, on the other hand, then we can see that this simple necessitarian theory of causality is not coherent with his ontology of being. If you pay attention only to his explanations concerning the necessary connection, you will lose the point. You have to come to this world process to see his actual explanation. Because for him, that necessary connection is not so much important. It is important for us in this worldly life. In the worldly life. So that is why we have to pay attention to that. But when he goes into that process, then he starts bringing mystical explanations. So his philosophy becomes mystical. Conventionality goes into mystical side, which he takes from mainly Ibn Arabi, of course, and Ibn Arabi's followers. Now, because wujud, in the absolute sense, manifests itself from the lowest levels of existence, in an evolutionary process, to the highest levels of perfection. In a process, all we need is a final cause. So therefore, in individual events, you don't need a cause. The causation is not real at that level anymore. The important thing is the final cause. That is transcendent in the Sadrian sense, which is indeed the only and actual cause of the whole world process. So, as you can see, the individual causality is lost here. But when we go down to the particular processes within the evolutionary cosmological process, due to the rise of essences in the mind, we are able to analyze certain phenomena, one of which is the original Aristotelian causal events in the physical world. In that case, Sadra's theory of causality can be viewed as an improved version of the necessitarian Aristotelian causal theory, or a new version of the occasionalist theory. In a sense, he is combining both, but I'm not sure whether he is successful or not. We can discuss that. And evaluate later on. Let me not say anything at the moment. Now, in order to explain this, then we have to go to that world process. And what I did actually, I paid attention. I took only one chapter, which summarizes his whole cosmology in only one chapter, just about 8 or 10 pages or so, which is an excellent explanation. That you can see how he is combining all of these different traditions into one theory, into one cosmological theory. I really worked quite a lot on this chapter, a few years, although it is only 10 pages, and I have been able to translate it. I will read some sections of my translations to you. But on the basis of that, I made a table to show that world process here, which is a very bad table actually. It doesn't represent Mulasada, but in order to show the evolutionary movement, it would bring us the concepts that he is utilizing mainly from actually Ibn Sina and Aristotelian tradition that he brings. And if you pay attention only to this, if you move away from the details, like the details here you can see when I say inanimate beings, some base minerals, he gives examples of these. Lime, gypsum, ammonia, and so on. And they are all leveled according to their perfection. From less perfect to more perfect. There is a movement like this. But this is a unidirectional movement. Whereas in Mulasada, it is actually circular movement. It is not unidirectional. And that is why he calls it the great circle of being. So one circle is the descending circle from higher to lower forms, and the other one from the lower to the higher forms. He gives that explanation, and he explains this in a detailed way in this chapter. Now, existence as a whole exhibits just one being, in which we observe many processes working in two opposing directions, each of which corresponds to an order. First, when viewed from the lower perspective, there is an ascending order, which is seen as descending when viewed from the perspective of perfection. See, as you can see, he's always trying to combine these. The first perspective is called, I think here I didn't give my translation, I just have the Arabic, Al-Imkan al-Ashraf. Al-Imkan al-Ashraf. And the second one is, he calls Al-Imkan al-Akhas. Akhas. Let me see in my translation, nobler possibility. Okay, and actually this is brought up by Ibn Sina and Sohrawardi before him. He's utilizing the same terminology. The only thing in his book, he says the first one is actually introduced by the first master, namely Aristotle, but the second one I introduce, he says. Whereas in Sohrawardi we see it actually. So I was not able to find why he is trying to say that. Now, because of these two types of possibilities, nobler and perhaps particular possibilities. Nobler and particular possibilities. Yes. These perspectives are stated as rules, declaring that if there is something, as long as it is, there must also be something prior and posterior to it in the levels of existence. Okay? The former being less and the latter more perfect than that thing itself. Suppose there is something here, the one that comes before will be less perfect. The one after it is more perfect. And so on. This will continue like that. So therefore, this is an evolutionary process. Once this is accepted, we have established an order of existence that is evolutionary. Sadra states that we must assume a causal chain within this system as a whole. Otherwise, there would not be an order at all. again, just if you pay attention, you can see he's going into the individual events here. Doesn't consider, okay? So from the general, when you go to particular, you can see the causal chain, okay? But this causal chain cannot be infinite. Hence, it must begin from matter and end in God, or vice versa, because then that will be the descending order. Physics discusses the first order, while metaphysics discusses the second as an existential evolutionary process. This is the ascending order begins from the lowest level, which is pure matter, prime matter in Aristotle, which is almost non-existent, and as such it has only potentiality for existence. It needs a form in order to have a concrete existence, and the first and thus the lowest form it receives is the corporeal form, a surah jamadiyya. In this way, the next level of perfection is realized as the simple elements are produced. Simple elements move towards the next level of perfection, and of course at each level they are also hierarchically ordered amongst each other. Okay, like the minerals. There is a mineral lower, another higher, until you reach the highest mineral, which you cannot distinguish from plants. So in one respect it looks as if it is mineral, and therefore jamid, inanimate. But in another respect, when you look, it looks like plants and animate also at the same time. Okay? This way, the evolutionary process continues through a hierarchical order and arrangement, and in this arrangement, until it reaches the realm of the supreme angels, which is the highest level of perfection for humans, the representative of the material regions, human beings. In this evolutionary process, all beings are essentially reduced to one unit. And the beginning point of these beings are conjoined with their ends, and vice versa. This great unity is called the circle of existence, the circle of being, actually, I should say, Dâiratul Vücûd. The first half of which is the descending arch, and the other half is the ascending arch. Here, unfortunately, I showed only one way. If possible to make it into a circle, maybe it would perhaps represent this theory in a much better way. Now, I will read the last paragraphs of this chapter in the translation. And he says that according to the ordinary philosophers, usually he distinguishes the mystical philosophers from the ordinary philosophers. Muhakkikun, as they are called, they are the mystical philosophers, and hukama are the regular ordinary philosophers. According to them, he says, acts of nature and within the sensible beings. And God Almighty has entrusted this within the sensible beings. But for us, Muhakkikun, the mystical philosophers, in other words, the acts of nature and material sensible beings end at the initial levels of the animal level. So for the ordinary philosophers, at the human level it ends. But for us, it says at the animal level it ends. Immediately afterwards begins the act of the soul. The acts of the soul and the imaginary formal beings, which are detached from this material world. As you know, creator imagination is very important for the Tasawwuf philosophers. Okay, that is why he's making a reference to that. Imaginary form. That's the only way I could translate it into English. When you say imaginary, it is, you think it's fictitious, but in Arabic it doesn't mean that really. Al-Akwan al-Khayaliyya al-Suriyya, the terms that he is utilizing in Arabic. Because khayal, imagination, has different functions, and one of them is creative imagination in the Tasawwuf tradition. So immediately afterwards begins the act of the soul and the imaginary formal beings which are detached from this material world. This continues as far as it arrives at a point where they commence to acquire excellences additional to those of the animals as such. They also begin to obtain the intelligibles through their own will, endeavor and effort until they reach the realm of the heavenly sphere and that of the supreme angels. This, insofar as man is concerned, is the highest human level. Within human beings are essentially, all are essentially reduced to one unit, and the beginning points are conjoined with their ends. And this is what we call the great circle of being. The first half of which is the descending arch, and the other half is the ascending arch. For a circle is that, well, this is the Euclidean definition, I think, which is defined as a single line, begins by moving from a point where it also ends. So that is the circle. Actually, of course, in this definition, it's
ellipse also.
Yeah, ellipse also, right? But this is perfect. This is a perfect circle.
You should have said the locus.
The locus.
Equidistance points from the center.
Yeah,
This is
to the center, right? But in the definition also, he said, begins and ends. Actually, there is no beginning and there is no end. There is no beginning, no end. It is only when you try to define it, that there is no other way you can define it. So the circle of existence is made one. The terms are really, in Arabic, they are very great in this terminology. The circle of existence is made one, whose limits and semicircles are conjoined with one another, and in which plurality is made a unity that clearly and demonstratively proves the oneness of its creator and originator, and shows its wisdom, power, munificence, generosity. Blessed is the name of our God, sublime and benefactor. Here is from the Quran, of course, it quotes, makes a quotation. But if you see the reference here to unity and plurality, when you juxtapose them, it is exactly, it corresponds to the juxtaposition of necessitarian theory with the occasionalist theory. Because, you see, there is only one thing, but how can you explain the multiplicity in the universe? So in the same way, if the causal nexus is not necessary, how can you account for the necessity in the actual world? You see, that is why he's bringing in this evolutionary process. But I have not been able to cite a clear reference to this in Boğaziçi. This is my own explanation, that he has this in mind, and that is why he, from time to time, when he talks about the process, he makes reference to causality. So that's the way that's how I understand him, really. For if the abode of existence is one, its builder must also be but one. And God encompasses them all around. This is again a verse from the Quran. If you conceive in as much as we can convey to you what we have conveyed, or at least I try to convey, or understand, and come to be acquainted with the state for which you have been created, referring to the human beings, and assigned, and you are also appointed. This makes reference to the notion of Khalifa actually in the Quran. And also recognize, you see, again, the Arabic terminology in utilizing the mystical terminology makes reference to the epistemological aspect also, because he says arafta. As you know, it means experiential knowing, not theoretical, like you do in sciences. So that is why I try to translate as recognize rather than to know. The realm, ufuk, again, I translate as realm, actually means horizon.
Horizon.
Right? Which is connected with your realm, again with your horizon, that moves you and transforms you from level to level, and ascends you from rank to rank. You see, in other words, here, I think he makes a reference to the microcosm, human beings as microcosm, representative of the universe. The way in the universe there is an evolutionary movement from less perfection to more perfection, human beings also, if in their spiritual journeys, they make the same journey, if they follow that path, in other words, and for which they are created. You will then have a firm belief and true conviction in the rest of your constitution. And you shall begin to witness what has been absent from your physical eyes. You shall, moreover, progressively advance in the noble sciences, al-ulum al-sharifa, the propedeutic of which you have so far obtained. So that means up until now, until the end of physics, because after this, actually he goes to psychology, where he actually talks about those mystical experiences. So he said, this is the propedeutic. This is the introduction to that. You have already obtained all of these. In attaining them, we take up the instruments and prepare our understanding, sharpen our intelligence, and strengthen our potential intellect. You shall thus reach the inner knowledge, ma'rifah, inner knowledge of things, and their real nature, and thereupon to the divine sciences that are conducive to the tables of God, the glorious, the sublime, and His blessings. You shall thus begin to receive divine effulgence and tranquility. You will then be relieved of the anxieties caused by your physical nature and of its stimulations towards bodily inclinations, so that you begin to observe the levels of beings and to encompass all the levels which you have traversed by gradual ascension and your transformation into the prostrators among the stations of being. Then he gives a brief explanation of this also, how this can be achieved by human beings. What I have tried to do is that actually he is depending two opposing theories by, again, combining other opposing theories, such as many, plurality, and maybe some other like change, and baqa, endurance, yes. Because one of his theories, this is very well known, according to, again, that's where he departs from the Aristotelians. As you know, according to Aristotle, substance does not change. It is substratum of change, actually. It takes the change. But according to Mullah Sadra, everything changes, including substance. Okay? Why? It's because of this existential movement. It is this existential movement which moves from one level to another in both directions. All of them he's trying to combine in one general theory. But one thing that strikes me is his eclectic approach. I believe that if he could leave some of the Aristotelian concepts behind, he would perhaps be more successful. Such as if you don't defend substance as enduring, then you don't need that notion anymore. You have being. You should, like Ibn Arabi, you should stick to that notion. But he's not like that, unfortunately. He wants to bring everything, from Aristotle, from Ibn Sina, from Ibn Arabi, from Dawood al-Qaysari, from Maulana Rumi, all of them, and he tries to weave into one another, and then he's, at least we are lost. I don't know if he was lost or not, but actually I have seen some articles written on his theory of causality. I see some articles defend that he's defending the necessary connection. Others, he's denying. How can it be? I mean, the same philosopher defending both theories. So it is because of this approach, I think. But the only theory that combines all of this is his doctrine of Tashkik. Doctrine of Tashkik, and that is why I translate it as evolutionary existential movement. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Açıkgenç. And now we open the floor to questions and answers again. I guess we have plenty of time, so
Thank you very much, Professor Alparslan, for this eloquent summary, I should say, of Sadra. I came across shortly with the Sadra's philosophy, Hikmatul Muta'ali and stuff.
Yes.
And I found that he was actually, he tried to combine philosophy, mysticism, and Kalam.
Yes.
In one thought.
Yes.
In fact, your last sentence, best description, it's perhaps the best description. This Sheikh, Mullah Sadra, wanted to mix everything. So when I read him, sometimes I face Aristotle, sometimes I face Ibn Arabi, sometimes I face Ibn Sina.
Yes.
But I'm not sure whether he was successful. In the end, I cannot conclude actually, because I haven't devoted enough time to the study of Sadra in details. But I got this. Concerning this process, especially, by the way, it would have been much perhaps interesting to compare what you said about this chart,
Yes.
in the very details, with Al-Jahar in the book of Al-Haywan,
Right.
and Ibn Maskaway.
Yes.
Also, he has similar contribution. These two are before Mullah Sadra. I'm not sure whether Ibn Khaldun was before Mullah Sadra also, because Ibn Khaldun also mentions
Yes.
this chart.
He is also before Mullah Sadra.
Before Mullah Sadra. So as you see, it seems that Mullah Sadra was influenced by these people somehow, because it is the very same details they use. Al-Jahab to less extent, Ibn Miskawayh is more extended than Al-Jahab, and Ibn Khaldun more elaborate, I should say, than. So it would be interesting for anybody who would go and study this topic to take your work and continue, or perhaps you can supervise a study about this very vital question, provided that we make a distinction between levels of existence, whether they are isolated levels, or whether they are continual evolutionary tree of evolution, whether it is continuous process.
Yes.
As you said. This, I'm not sure. I couldn't find any thorough study, and I hope that somebody will do such a work in the near future. Thank you very much indeed again.
You are welcome. Actually, there are some works on that. Just before I came, I was reading an article. I took a note, but I forgot the name of the author. He talks about this and he compares it with the Darwinian theory. And at the end, he also comes to the conclusion that in Mullah Sadra, evolution comes to a stage and stops there, and doesn't make a passage to the next species. Like, for example, the animal world, okay? They evolve until they come to the monkey, and Mullah Sadra says, monkey is the passage from animal to the human world. Right. Yeah, in Nazareth there are many Muslim philosophers defending this theory, but then the passage is not explained. So as a result, he thinks that it is they are attached to each other as layers, but not passing from one species to another.
That's right.
So therefore, it's not Darwinian evolution.
Not only that, but not talk about Darwinian evolution in this case at all, even if it is attached.
Yeah.
Because, for one good reason, that Darwinian evolution, by the way, rests on two pillars.
Because I found one, yes, in science and religion debate, comparing Miskawayh with Darwin, and reading from Miskawayh, and he says this is Darwinian evolution. It is not, because Darwin's theory of evolution rests on two pillars: random mutation and natural selection. And none of these two have been mentioned by these philosophers. They were not advanced to the level to talk about mutation, genetical or whatever, even if you talk about mutation in terms of cell division. At the time of Darwin, it was known. They know the cell. But at the time of Miskawayh or Mullah Sadra, it's not. So we shouldn't. Also, the natural selection is an important part of the Darwinian process, which is not mentioned in any of the writings.
But there is one hadith that he quotes is very interesting.
Yes.
Which is also, in a sense, Darwinian, but in a different way. And actually, I think this hadith is found in Bukhari also.
I have quoted this hadith in
Oh, you did?
studies.
He says,
that
Ekrim ammetekel nakla, right? That famous, well-known hadith.
Yeah.
Namely, I'll read the translation. Respect your aunt, the date palm. Muhammad, yes. For it was created out of Adam's remaining clay.
Yeah, not only that, there's another hadith which says by Prophet Muhammad in explaining فَخَلَقَكَ فَسَوَّاكَ فَعَدَّلَكَ or فَعَدَلَكَ في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك. He says, oh, the Son of Man, you should always praise your Creator who enabled you to stand on your 2 feet and walk
Raise you.
and raised you.
Yes, yes.
At the time you were walking on 4
Right.
legs. It could be understood as if it is a revolutionary nation. I don't know.
Maybe it's so-called hadith, fake hadith.
Maybe might be also it's true hadith, but he means to say the child. You know, when it's a childhood, you walk on 4 legs.
I would like to thank Dr. Açıkgenç for this nice presentation. I know how deeply he studied Mulla Sadra. Certainly I am not so knowledgeable about Sadra, but I would like to share my some results of my research on Al-Ghazali that might be illuminated maybe in interpreting Sadra as well. Some figures like Al-Ghazali, Mulla Sadra, maybe Wittgenstein or some similar kind of people have different phases in their life or different dimensions. And as Dr. Açıkgenç emphasized, we should look at all the works in interpreting these people. And when I studied Al-Ghazali, I realized that most of the discussion around causality relies upon the 17th discussion of the incoherence of the philosophers, where he discusses the possibility of miracles. There is a famous paragraph in which he talks about a certain particular event or object, and another certain particular event and object can be think without the other. You can think this without that, and you can think that without this. These are distinct events. There is no necessary relation between them. And also, observation cannot justify that there is a necessary link between them. So, these are possible events and miracles are possible, etc. However, usually we forget that. We forget why Al-Ghazali wrote the incoherence of the philosophers. Even in the first discussions, he says, I wrote this book to respond the philosophers, Neoplatonic Aristotelian philosophers. I will not give my own positive view in this book. It is remained for another project, and he gives the name of the book, Qawaid al-Aqaid, which is the second book of the Ihya, Revival of Revivifications, which he says he completed after the incoherence of the philosophers. So we shouldn't take whatever is written in the incoherence as the 100% view of Al-Ghazali. So we should also look at the other works in which he talks about causality. And Qawaid al-Aqaid is a chapter or a book in Ihya, but before it he wrote and completed a much more extended version of Qawaid al-Aqaid, as we know it today, Al-Iqtisad fil I'tiqad. And you can see one of the copy or English translation of the book in our book display. Please check it after the section. In that book, Al-Ghazali, apart from defending that there is no necessary relation between events, he also defends the view that God is the direct cause of every particular event. There is no intermediary between God's causation and events' occurrence. If we take this approach as the genuine view of Al-Ghazali, given what he says in the Incoherence, then it seems that the issue about causality is not only the necessary connection between finite events, this is just one part of the issue, but also establishing that God is the direct cause, the sole direct cause of every single event. If we read the works, maybe on the basis of such clues in the other texts, maybe we can develop an original approach and a general view of the scholar in question. If you look at, for example, Tahafut, in Tahafut, the Incoherence, Al-Ghazali also defends a view in which finite beings have their own causality. Even in the 17th discussion, you can explain miracles without even denying causality, even without even denying natures. If you combine different kinds of natures together in an unusual combination, there appear extraordinary events, and it is called miracle by many people. The point here is, this might not be the genuine view of Al-Ghazali, given what he says as a clue in somewhere in the text. And if we, I don't know, if can we follow some clues in a Molla Sadra as well, to produce such a unified picture of him. Maybe he talks many things from the earlier traditions, but can we find some clue about whether he denies some of them or he accepts other of them? What do you think about that?
Actually, I would say he loves all the philosophers before himself. He always talks very good about them. Even if I go chronologically, say the great Greek philosophers, not only Aristotle, even before him, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, all of them, makes references and he takes whatever he approves. He criticizes also some of their doctrines, that it shouldn't be like that, it should be like this. So he has to, because some parts of the theory does not fit into his tashkik doctrine, he doesn't accept it. He has to criticize that. But he doesn't reject it wholesale. There's no wholesale rejection. So, especially the terms, as I said, if I were him, I would not utilize the term substance. Never. Being, stick to being, like Ibn Arabi. Okay, because you don't need anymore, that one. And if you go further, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina mainly Ibn Sina of course, then Ibn Arabi, and then mainly Ibn Arabi's great interpreter Dawud al-Qaysari, and Sadruddin Konevi again, the famous followers, and even Al-Karabi. These are the later Ottoman philosophers. Their interpretation of Nasrawi, Mevlana's magnum opus, and also their interpretation of Fusus, Ibn Arabi's books. So, Ibn Razi, and of course the great Sufi thinkers like Ariduddin Attar, and all other ones that passed, you can find reference to almost all of them. He likes them, likes all of them. He doesn't reject them. He criticizes some of the theories that he doesn't accept. But he pays attention to almost every concept that they have. Every philosophical, ontological, epistemological, cosmological concepts, he utilizes all of them. All of them, And that is why it becomes a great eclectic system, his whole philosophical system. And that is why, perhaps, he gives a different name, al-hikmah muta'aliyah. That is how he defines his own philosophy, meaning transcendental philosophy. That's how we can translate, I suppose, into English. Transcendental philosophy. Again, Sayyid Nasr accepts theosophy, a different name.
Thank you.
So I was just wondering if you thought that for Sadra, movement or this evolutionary development holds true at all levels of existence, or is it only true at material existence? And I ask that because in the chapter on motion in the physics,
Yes.
he seems to limit movement to things which have matter, right? And
Yes.
so, in things which are non-material, it wouldn't make sense to speak of them as in, say, development in the sense of motion proper,
Right.
right?
Right. Maybe I wouldn't think that he would use the term motion in that sense, but still there is an evolutionary tekamul in the word we would use in Arabic, right? Perfection, from levels of perfection. They pass from one level to another. So in the spiritual realm, you notice he said that, but his description is not like in the physical realm. Where you would properly use the term motion, right? But in the spiritual realm, there is no other way. We have to use the word movement, from one level of perfection to another. But again, it's not in the physical sense.
Right, so then in that sense it wouldn't be any different from the way, for example, Ibn Sina says,
Right.
the separate intellects emanate from God.
Heavenly spheres.
Yeah,
The heavenly spheres.
okay.
Realms of angels.
Thanks for that. I learned a lot. Could you help me make one link? So I got the idea that there was this cosmological evolutionary process as being, in some sense, the kind of what's fundamentally going on in the world. Could you just tell me how does that illuminate? You might say paradigmatic cases of causation. Just hammering a rock with a hammer.
Right.
What's the connection there?
In order to explain that, we have to go to Ibn Arabi's notion of being, which he took from him actually, wujud, okay? Namely, the highest being, as he is in himself, is called wujud, because we don't know, we cannot describe it in any other terms. As he descends from level to level, but this descending is through manifestations of his names, attributes, and af'al. How can you translate af'al? Because acts maybe, actions maybe not so good, maybe acts is better. All these creations actually, we can translate like that. So through that, he, as he descends, at each level, things are created by him. And there is, in that sense, only one true cause, which I quoted him at one place, and that is God. So in the evolutionary movement, there is only one cause, God, both in the descending order and in the ascending order. Perhaps, I'm not sure if he's saying this is my interpretation, I'll bring this. In the ascending order, it will be efficient cause. But in the ascending, he will be final cause. In the descending order, he will be efficient cause. Or he will manifest himself in that way. I don't know. So as a result, you don't need any other causes in that moment. But then, when you start, okay, now I would like to see what is going on here, forget about this whole process. And when you go there, then there is physical causation, physical causality. And then there is necessity. Because the way God acts as both efficient and final cause is by utilizing those things also in the world. I don't know if this connects both theories together or not. This is my explanation. As I said, I have not been able to see a direct reference to this in Sardar's works. I hope one day somebody will find, or if somebody knows, please let me know.
Just grab the microphone. Thanks. I was really intrigued in your response to Nazif, I think. You said that the best way to describe Sardar's philosophy is transcendental philosophy.
Yeah, that was his term. His term.
Well, okay.
It's his own term. I'm not describing that. That is
Really?
not my interpretation.
Oh, okay. Well then,
Muta'al in Arabic means transcendental.
in the sense of like scholastic transcendentals,
Yes.
because of course when I hear transcendental philosophy, I think,
I'm not sure if this would not be in the Kantian sense.
yeah, that's what I wanted to ask
Right.
about.
Right.
Okay. So then it's a reference to being. It's
Right.
fundamental.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
As you said, Mullah Sadr always expresses himself in a Sadr al-Muta'allidin.
Muta'alliqin. Yes.
Sadr al-Muta'allidin.
Right.
Sadr al-Shari'a.
Right.
حكمة متعالية. He finds himself like a prophet by that.
Yes.
Well, the man has a collection of philosophy.
One of his epitaphs is Sadr al-Muta'alliqin, the grand theologian, perhaps, right?
Not even that, more than
Philosopher, if you use Professor Nasser's term.
He is part of heavenly or part of, it's like Jesus Christ.
You know, no, Muta'alliq, pay attention to Ibn Sina''s book on metaphysics, following Aristotle, he calls it ilahiyat.
I know
So
that.
Muta'alliq would be someone who deals with ilahiyat, not in that sense,
Not
please.
in that.
No, don't misunderstand. Yeah,
He
someone
has
who,
no divine
no, not at all. No, not at all. Muta'alliq means someone who deals with ilahiyat, with theology.
in Persian.
Yes.
I know it is in Turkish.
In Turkish also, yes, Dawood al-Qaysari,
But are you
some
sure
philosophy.
Persian means ilahiyat also?
Yes, definitely. I have no doubt. Yes, exactly, that's what it means. Yes. That's it.
I
So
read,
Muta'alliq might mean also someone who belongs to the divine realm
Yeah,
in Arabic.
that's
That's
nice. That's what
Yes.
it means.
Yes.
I guess we have to stop here because we exceeded time by 5 minutes, so we're